under the weight of chandeliers that sparkled like captured stars and walls lined with portraits of triumph. A hush carried through the mansion, not of peace, but of judgment. The air itself seemed thick with expectation, as though every marble tile demanded perfection from anyone who dared to tread across it. Within those towering halls, someone moved quietly, not out of choice, but because the silence felt safer than the echoes of mockery. He was there, present in every room, yet treated as though invisible, his presence noted only when failure was mentioned. Every gaze from those who served and those who ruled weighed heavier than gold, each one whispering a question that would not fade. What happens when the one you dismiss carries the very power to unmake everything you believe secure? This is the story that unravels from shadows, a story where injustice ripens until it can no longer be hidden. Watch closely, because the smallest detail will matter later. If this intrigues you, if you sense where it might lead, remember to like this story, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you think lies ahead. The mansion was a fortress of wealth, a place where every corner gleamed with the brilliance of money spent, but not necessarily of love given. The marble floors reflected light from chandeliers that had hung longer than the boy had been alive. Yet in the middle of all this grandeur sat a child who felt smaller than the dust the maids swept away each morning. He was only 12, with blonde hair falling limply over his forehead, shoulders slouched forward as if carrying a weight invisible to the world, but crushing to him alone. The polished mahogany desk in front of him was not a tool for learning, but a stage where his failures were displayed again and again. Test papers covered in red ink lay scattered, some torn from erasers rubbed too hard, others crumpled in anger or shame. Each mark of failure burned like a wound that refused to heal. To anyone else, the errors might have seemed fixable, but to him, they were permanent scars that proved his father right. The boy's father was a man who measured value the way he measured profits, through results. He had built an empire of glass towers and iron contracts, negotiating deals with precision and ruthlessness. To him, nothing was more important than outcomes, and nothing was more disgraceful than weakness. That afternoon, he had entered the study, tall and broad, his voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. He picked up one of the papers as though it were evidence in a trial, his cold eyes flicking across the F at the top. "Worthless," he muttered, not just about the grade, but about the boy himself. The word landed like a hammer, shattering whatever confidence the child might have had left. This was not the first time he heard it, nor would it be the last, but repetition didn't dull the sting. Instead, it etched deeper into the boy's heart, convincing him that his father's judgment was truth. He had tried to please his father. The boy had sat for hours staring at words that refused to stay still. They danced, flipped, and blurred until they no longer resembled anything familiar. Numbers tangled themselves into knots that no amount of erasing could undo. He pressed his pencil harder into the paper, desperate to make sense of it all. But the harder he tried, the further the meaning slipped away. The other children he saw at private lessons or school seemed to breeze through their work. They laughed, played, and carried themselves with ease. But for him, even copying a single line felt like climbing a mountain with no summit in sight. He didn't need his father's anger to feel the shame. It already lived inside him, whispering that he was broken. The mansion, for all its grandeur, only amplified his isolation. Servants passed by with downcast eyes, careful not to linger, careful not to pity too openly. Their whispers, however soft, reached his ears. They speculated about whether the boy was truly the son of such a powerful man, or if something in him had gone terribly wrong. Tutors came and went, each one arriving with glossy binders and promises of transformation, each one leaving with frustration etched on their faces. His father threw money at the problem, convinced that wealth could solve anything, but money could not reorder the letters that scrambled in front of the boy's eyes. Money could not still the panic in his chest when faced with another test. Money could not give him what he lacked. That evening, the boy sat alone in his room. Around him, trophies lined the shelves, symbols of accomplishments that weren't his own, but had been bought in his name. They mocked him silently, gleaming reminders of expectations he could never meet. In his hands, he held the latest test result, the red F slashing across the page like a final verdict. He whispered to himself, not with defiance, but with resignation, "Maybe I'm broken." His words vanished into the silence, unheard by anyone who might have cared. For him, it was not just a grade. It was his identity, his curse, his truth. The mansion seemed colder that night, the vastness pressing down on him until he felt suffocated by emptiness. Beyond his door, the father spoke to his assistant about the possibility of boarding school. The words drifted through the hallway, reaching the boy's ears. Boarding school. To him, it wasn't a fresh start, but a place where children like him were sent away to be forgotten. He imagined himself lost among strangers, cast aside, branded a failure too great to be redeemed. His father had made up his mind, and the boy could feel the inevitability of it settling like a heavy fog. Every object was a reminder of his father's empire, achievements that seemed as unreachable as the stars. At dinner, he sat across from his father at a table, so long that he barely felt they were in the same room. Silverware gleamed, polished to perfection, but he could not taste the food. His father tapped a knife against a plate, not in rhythm, but in impatience, each clang a reminder that failure was unwelcome. Across the room, servants stood by, eyes lowered. They carried trays and poured drinks, but none dared look at the boy for long. They whispered when they thought he wasn't listening, words carried like daggers through the air. Some shook their heads, saying it was a pity the child wasn't like the father. Others muttered that he didn't belong in this house of power. The boy pretended not to hear, but he always did. Their pity pressed down on him just as much as his father's anger. Later, in the study, he picked up a book with pages so heavy it felt like stone. The letters blurred, rearranged, and slipped off the page no matter how long he stared. He pressed the pencil harder, scratching into the paper until the lead snapped. Frustration swelled inside him, but he held back tears. He knew that tears were weakness, and weakness was unforgivable here. He thought about the tutors who had come before, each one promising to fix him. They arrived with confidence, speaking quickly, commanding him to follow along. At first, he tried. He wanted so badly to prove himself, to see his father's approval even for a moment. But the words never settled in his mind. The letters always refused to stay put. And soon the tutor's patience vanished, replaced with sighs, rolled eyes, and finally the sound of luggage wheels echoing through the hallway as they left the mansion behind. His father called them unprofessional. The boy called them his failures. In the servants' quarters, voices floated through the air while they cleaned dishes late into the night. Another tutor gone, one said, "Rich people think money buys brains." Another answered, "Poor kid. He looks lost." They thought their voices quiet, but the boy heard them all. And though they meant no harm, each whisper carved deeper into him, confirming what he already believed, that he was hopeless. He went back upstairs and sat on the edge of his bed, staring at trophies lined neatly across his dresser. Footballs, medals, ribbons, all symbols of victories his father had purchased or forced upon him. They weren't earned, they were decorations. He touched one of the trophies, its cold surface reflecting his face back at him, distorted by gold plating. It did not look like him. It looked like someone he could never be. The house was full of such lies, illusions of success that reminded him only of his failures. The scent of polished wood mixed with expensive cologne filled the halls, overwhelming him as he tried to breathe. This mansion that impressed everyone else suffocated him. It was a palace built for giants, but he was only a boy too small for its walls, too weak for its expectations. To most of the city, he was a figure to admire, a man whose wealth and power seemed limitless. But to the boy, he was not a hero, not a father in the way he quietly longed for, but a force of pressure that weighed on him until he could hardly breathe. That evening in the study, the boy sat at the massive mahogany desk while his father loomed over him, a test paper in hand. The bright red F bleeding across the top like a wound that could not be hidden. The father's jaw was tight, his voice clipped and cold. He shook the page as if shaking the boy's entire identity loose from him. "Worthless," he spat. the word vibrating through the cavernous room and lodging itself into the boy's chest. It was not the first time he had heard it, but repetition did not dull its edge. It only drove the blade deeper. The boy did not cry, did not protest. His lips remained sealed, his eyes fixed on the floor, as though looking up might provoke more anger, as though defending himself might be more dangerous than silence. He sat there numb, his small hands clenched into fists under the desk, nails digging into his palms just to remind himself that he was still alive. The father paced the room, his shoes clicking against the polished floor like a metronome of judgment. He spoke of failure as though it were a disease, something that must be cut out before it infected the family's reputation. To him, every grade was a reflection of the family name, every mistake a crack in the empire he had built. He reminded the boy of the money he had spent on tutors, the specialists flown in from across the world, the programs purchased at staggering costs. None of it had worked, and to the father, this was proof not of flawed teaching, but of a flawed child. The boy listened, his chest tightening with every word, until he felt small enough to vanish into the cracks between the marble tiles. At dinner later that night, the conversation carried over, as it often did. The father's voice carried across the long dining table, heavy with disdain. He compared the boy's failures to the successes of men twice his age, men he employed, men who obeyed. He saw no reason why his son should not achieve greatness, why he should not master the simplest of tasks. He spoke of discipline, of effort, of strength. What he did not see, what he refused to see, was that the boy's struggle was not laziness or rebellion, but something deeper, invisible, a quiet storm inside his mind. To the father, weakness was inexcusable. To the boy, it was inescapable. After dinner, the father retreated to his study with contracts piled high on his desk. His assistant trailed behind, pen in hand, listening as the man muttered about boarding school, about sending the boy somewhere that tolerated no excuses. Someplace where they will break him into shape, he said, the words falling like a sentence. The boy stood just outside the doorway, unseen, his small frame pressed against the wall. He heard every syllable, and though he had expected it, the confirmation twisted in his gut. Boarding school was not a new beginning to him. It was exile, abandonment, punishment wrapped in a different name. Upstairs, alone in his room again, he stared at the shelves lined with trophies. They gleamed in the dim light, polished by hands that were not his. He reached for one, a heavy golden cup with his name engraved across the base. But the name felt foreign, belonging not to him, but to the version of himself his father demanded. He set it back down, the weight of it burning into his arms, and slumped onto the bed. He clutched the latest failed test, his fingers crumpling the edges until the paper tore. His father's words echoed in his head, pounding against his skull until they drowned out all other thoughts. Worthless, disgrace, failure. He whispered into the empty room, "Maybe I am broken," his voice barely louder than a breath. The sound of it startled him, as though saying it aloud made it real. He stared at the ceiling, its ornate carvings twisting into shapes his mind could not hold. His eyes burned, but no tears fell. He had taught himself not to cry, because crying had only ever made things worse. Instead, he closed his eyes, and all he could see were the red letters scrawled across every page, the letters that defined him more than his own name. He felt his father's shadow looming even in dreams, a specter that demanded perfection where he had none to give. Poor child. A shame, really. A cook wiped his hands on a cloth and said, "It isn't the money. Some children are just not cut from the same cloth." His father builds empires. He can't even finish a sentence. Their words were not meant to wound, but they did. They reinforced what his father had already declared. He was broken, hopeless, a burden wrapped in silk and marble. The boy remembered every face of every tutor who had crossed the mansion's threshold. Men in tailored suits who carried themselves like generals, women with sharp eyes and sharper voices, foreign specialists who arrived with briefcases full of promises. Each one sat across from him with determination, sure they would succeed where others had failed. The first days were always the same: smiles, optimism, assurances to his father that progress would come. But by the end of the week, the smiles cracked, the optimism soured, and the assurance turned into resignation. The boy would see their frustration in the way they rubbed their temples, in the way their voices grew sharper, in the sighs that filled the room when he stumbled over another line of text. Then came the inevitable, the closed-door conversations with his father, the muffled words, the sound of footsteps leaving the mansion forever. One by one, they all left. None stayed. None believed he could be fixed. His father's patience thinned with each departure. He had spared no expense, and each failure was not just the boy's disgrace, but his own. The empire he built demanded solutions, and he could not tolerate a problem that drained both money and pride. Boarding school, he muttered one evening, pacing his study while his assistant scribbled notes. Somewhere strict, somewhere that will break him down and build him back up. The assistant nodded dutifully, clicking his pen, as though this were just another business deal. To the boy, standing unnoticed at the edge of the hall, the words fell like a gavel. Boarding school. The phrase echoed through his mind like a chant, cold and final. He pictured a place where children like him were sent away, not to learn, but to vanish. He imagined endless corridors with locked doors, teachers with eyes like his father's, disappointment sharper than punishment. It was not an opportunity. It was exile. That night, the boy retreated to his room, his sanctuary and his prison. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the shelves lined with trophies he hadn't earned. They glittered mockingly in the lamplight. He pulled one down, a golden figure holding a wreath aloft. It was heavy in his hands, heavier than its size should allow. He turned it over, saw his name etched into the base, and felt a surge of bitterness. The trophy was a lie, a symbol of victories he had not won. His father had filled the house with these tokens, as though buying them could disguise the truth. But the boy knew. They were hollow, just like the mansion, just like the words of encouragement strangers offered when they first met him. He replaced the trophy and picked up a crumpled test paper instead. The red F glared up at him, louder than gold, louder than marble, louder than chandeliers. It was the truth he could not escape. Below in the kitchen, the servants continued their chatter, their voices carrying through vents and staircases. "The father won't stand for this much longer," one said. "Boarding school is the only way." Another added, "It might be better for him. Get him away from here. Toughen him up." The boy buried his face in his hands, wishing he could stop hearing, stop feeling, stop existing. He wondered if being sent away might be easier than staying, easier than facing the endless cycle of disappointment. But then he remembered the cold halls, the faceless voices, the absence of anyone who might care. At least here, in this vast and empty house, he still belonged to something, even if it was only to failure. The father returned late that night, stepping into the boy's room without knocking. He held another paper, another mark of failure. He didn't shout this time. His voice was quieter, but sharper, more cutting than rage. "You embarrass me," he said flatly. "You shame this family. I have given you everything, every chance, every tool. And still you fail." He tossed the paper onto the bed and turned away, already finished, already dismissing his son, as though he were an employee who had outlived his usefulness. The boy stared at the page, at the F stamped in red, and felt the weight of the word pressing down on him again. Worthless. He whispered it to himself, the word now indistinguishable from his own name. He fell asleep with the paper clenched in his hand, dreams haunted by whispers and shadows of teachers who walked away. In his dream, the mansion loomed taller than ever, its chandeliers swinging like pendulums, its marble walls closing in. He saw doors slamming shut, tutors disappearing into smoke, his father's voice booming through endless corridors. When he awoke, the whisper of boarding school was still there, echoing in his chest. He sat up, staring at the morning light creeping across the floor, and knew that nothing would change. He would be sent away. His father had decided, the servants had confirmed, and he himself had accepted. He was a problem to be discarded, a flaw to be hidden, a mistake to be exiled. They were prizes for achievements he had not earned, empty monuments to a legacy that did not belong to him. His father believed they would inspire him, But they only reminded him of his failures, each trophy like a mocking echo of what he was supposed to be, but could never reach. He picked one up, its golden figure raised high, triumphant. The engraving bore his name, but to him it felt like a stranger's. His reflection warped in the metal, a distorted face looking back at him, one he did not recognize. He put it down quickly, as though it burned. On the bed beside him lay the latest test paper, its corners crushed from where he had gripped it too tightly, the red F screaming louder than anything else in the room. He held it in his hand as though it were proof of a crime he had committed, as though at any moment the world would demand punishment. His father's words replayed in his mind, cold and sharp. Worthless, disgrace, failure. He mouthed them silently, not in protest, but in surrender, as though repeating them might ease the sting, as though embracing them might make them hurt less. But they didn't. Each repetition dug deeper until the words felt carved into him, permanent and undeniable. He whispered into the darkness, "Maybe I'm broken." The sound barely carried beyond his lips, but to him it was as loud as the shattering of glass. He had thought it before, felt it with every failed test and every scolding, but saying it aloud made it real, made it final. The words sank into the heavy air of the room, binding themselves to him like a curse. He leaned back on his bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, its ornate carvings twisting into shapes he couldn't name. They seemed to mock him too, patterns he could not untangle, images that slipped away when he tried to focus. His hands trembled, still gripping the paper. He didn't cry. Crying had been trained out of him. Crying brought no comfort, only more anger, more shame. Silence was safer. Silence was the only shield he had left. From below, faint voices drifted through the vents. The servants spoke in low tones as they cleaned the last of the dinner dishes, their words rising with the clatter of plates. "The boy's doomed," one said. "The father won't tolerate this much longer." Another sighed. "Boarding school. That's where he'll end up. Maybe it's better that way." They thought he couldn't hear, but he always did. Their words pressed against his ears, heavy and final, confirming the future he feared. To them, it was a solution. To him, it was exile. He imagined the boarding school as a place of shadows and locked doors, where boys like him were sent to be forgotten. He saw himself wandering endless hallways, surrounded by faces filled with scorn, teachers who shouted louder than his father, peers who saw his weakness and turned it into cruelty. He saw a life where he was not just a failure, but invisible, erased from the world he knew. The thought clawed at his chest until he could hardly breathe. He curled on his bed, the paper still in his hand, the edges tearing against his grip. The red F glowed in his mind like fire, burning away any hope he might have clung to. The mansion around him was vast, but in that moment it felt like it was collapsing inward. Walls pressing closer, ceiling lowering, air growing thinner. He wished, just for a moment, that it would crush him, that the weight of it all would end, that the shame would be silenced. But the night dragged on, and the weight remained. He closed his eyes, and sleep came fitfully, full of jagged images. In his dreams, the tutors lined up in a row, their faces blurred but their voices sharp, each one turning away from him in disgust, each one slamming a door as they left. His father loomed behind them, a towering figure of stone, eyes burning, mouth twisting with words he already knew: worthless, failure, broken. The trophies on the shelves rattled, toppled, shattered, until the floor was littered with gold fragments that cut into his bare feet as he tried to move. He stumbled, fell, and when he looked up, he saw the gates of a school rising in front of him, tall and forbidding, their iron bars closing as he ran toward them. The gates locked with a clang that echoed through the dream, and he woke with a start, sweat chilling his skin. Morning light crept across the floor, but it brought no comfort. He sat up slowly, body heavy, head bowed. The paper still lay in his hand, crumpled, damp from his palm. He smoothed it out, staring at the F once more, as though hoping it might change. It didn't. It never did. He placed it on the desk beside him, next to the trophies that glittered in the sunlight, mocking him once more. He felt small in the face of them, smaller than he had ever felt, a boy lost in a mansion built for men who demanded perfection. He whispered the words again, voice steady this time, as though reciting a truth he could no longer deny. Maybe I'm broken. And this time he believed it. The words still clung to him, heavier than the blanket that slid from his shoulders. He rose, dressed with sluggish movements, and stepped into the endless halls of the mansion, each corridor gleaming with marble and shadow. He knew another day of disappointment was waiting, another day of whispers in the kitchen, another day of being ignored by servants and scorned by his father. That morning, though, something new stirred at the far end of the service corridor. She entered quietly, unnoticed at first. Marissa Johnson, 32, walked through the staff entrance with steps that were neither hurried nor hesitant. Her shoes were scuffed, her uniform plain, her curls tied back beneath a simple scarf. On her shoulder hung a worn leather bag, its edges frayed, its strap cracked with years of use. It did not carry the polished air of tutors or the gleam of wealth, but the dignity of someone who had carried it through storms and still kept walking. She paused in the staff room, setting down her few belongings with care, as though each one carried memory. The cooks eyed her briefly while chopping vegetables, their whispers already forming judgments. "She's the new one," one muttered. "Won't last long," another answered with a smirk. "The boy drives them out faster than spoiled milk." They chuckled, shaking their heads, certain of their prediction. Marissa heard them, but she didn't respond. She had learned long ago that the ones who spoke the loudest often knew the least. She unpacked her cleaning supplies neatly, arranging them in quiet order, her hands moving with discipline born of a childhood where every task mattered, where care and patience were survival. The boy did not notice her at first. He was too consumed by the thought of another day failing to meet expectations. Yet, as he wandered down the stairs toward the dining room, he saw her briefly in the hallway. She was not like the others. She did not avert her gaze in pity, nor did she look through him as though he were invisible. She moved steadily, head high, presence calm, her eyes carrying a depth that made him pause for just a moment before hurrying on. He didn't know why, but something about her felt different. Marissa began her duties with quiet focus. She dusted shelves, polished silver, swept corners no one else noticed. She worked without complaint, without show. To the other staff, she was invisible, just another hand added to the mansion's machinery. But inside her, she carried memories that separated her from them. She remembered her own childhood, sitting at a cracked kitchen table, staring at words that danced and twisted, just as the boys did now. She remembered the shame of teachers' harsh words, the sting of being called slow, dumb, broken. And she remembered her mother, a woman who refused to let her drown in that pain, a woman who sat with her night after night, tracing letters in the air, whispering that she was not broken, that she only saw the world differently. Her mother had been her anchor, her patience the bridge that saved her. That mother was gone now, buried years ago, but her lessons lived on, stitched into Marissa's bones. She carried them silently, waiting for a moment when they might be needed again. By the afternoon, she moved near the study, where dust gathered on shelves lined with books the boy could not read. She paused when she heard it, the furious scratching of an eraser, the sound of paper tearing, followed by a groan of frustration. She froze in the doorway, eyes falling on the boy hunched over the desk, his blonde hair hanging forward, his small hand clenched tightly around a pencil. He pressed it into the page again and again, each time harder, until the paper tore at the edges. His shoulders shook with frustration he did not voice, and his face, pale and tense, carried the same expression she remembered from her own childhood. Wide eyes begging the page to make sense, shame boiling just beneath the surface. Marissa felt her chest tighten. It was as if time had folded, showing her a reflection of herself at his age. She remembered nights when she had gripped her pencil until her hand cramped, when she had stared at pages that refused to stay still, when her teachers had scolded her for laziness she did not feel. She remembered the heat of shame burning her cheeks as classmates laughed, the weight of being branded as less. She remembered the nights when her mother's hand steadied hers, when patience replaced punishment, when love rewrote what the world had written off. And now here before her, She saw that same storm in the boy's small frame. She did not step forward yet. She stood quietly in the doorway, watching him fight against the page, her heart aching with recognition. She wanted to speak, to tell him he was not broken, to show him the same patience her mother had shown her. But she knew better than to rush. She knew that trust was not given easily, especially to a child who had been scorned by every adult in his life. So she waited, silent, holding the memory of her mother's voice inside her chest, letting it guide her steps. Marissa moved quietly as she dusted shelves along the hallway, her rag tracing the spines of books that looked untouched for years. But her attention was drawn by the sounds from inside. At first, it was a rapid scrape of an eraser, frantic and harsh, followed by a groan that carried more despair than anger. She froze at the half-open door, then leaned just enough to see him. His small body trembled as he pressed the pencil into the page with such force his knuckles turned white and his fingertips reddened. Every stroke was an act of desperation, every line collapsing into failure. The letters refused to behave. They flipped, twisted, and blurred until the words disintegrated into chaos. Each attempt ended with another tear in the paper, another crumpled sheet tossed aside, another fragment of hope destroyed. Marissa's breath caught. She saw herself there years ago, seated at a kitchen table with chipped paint and uneven legs, gripping a dull pencil and staring at words that made no sense no matter how long she looked. Teachers had told her she was lazy, careless, incapable. She had felt the same shame rising in her chest as she stumbled over sounds that others spoke easily, the same hot flush of failure when classmates laughed. She remembered the nights of frustration, the helpless sobs when the letters refused to stay still, when every effort turned to nothing. And she remembered her mother, the one person who refused to give up on her, who sat beside her in those long nights, guiding her finger gently along each word, whispering that she was not broken, only different. Her mother's patience had been her lifeline, her anchor against the tide of shame. Now, as Marissa stood in the doorway of this mansion, she saw the same storm in the boy's eyes, and it pierced her with a pain she had not felt in years. The boy did not notice her at first. He was too consumed by his struggle, too trapped in the battle against the page. His shoulders rose and fell with ragged breaths, his jaw clenched, his pencil pressed harder with each failing attempt. He looked like a soldier fighting a war he could not win, armed with nothing but a fragile pencil against an army of shifting words. When the paper tore again under his hand, he let out a sound that was half-groan, half-sob, though no tears fell. He had learned to hold them back, just as he had learned to hold back hope. He leaned back in the chair, chest heaving, eyes staring at the ruined page as though it were proof of what he already knew, that he was broken, unfixable, unworthy of the name he carried. Marissa's hand tightened on the rag she held. She wanted to rush in to gather the papers, to tell him that she knew this pain, that he was not alone. But she also knew how fragile this moment was. She knew that too much pity, too much urgency would close him off, would make him retreat into the silence he had been taught to live with. She took a breath, steadying herself, and stepped just inside the doorway. Her footsteps were soft against the carpet, but the boy's head lifted, eyes wide, already braced for scolding. He expected anger, expected mockery, expected another adult's disappointment. Instead, what he found was a pair of eyes filled not with judgment, but recognition. Marissa did not speak immediately. She let the silence hold for a moment, let him see that she was not there to condemn him. Her gaze dropped to the shredded papers on the desk, then back to his trembling hands. She felt the ache in her chest deepen. She remembered her mother's words, soft and certain. Patience is the only way to unlock a locked door. So she did not push. She simply set the rag aside, straightened the papers gently, smoothing their crumpled edges as if they mattered, as if they were worth saving. She placed them back on the desk, her hand steady, then returned to the shelves, dusting as though nothing extraordinary had passed between them. The boy watched her with suspicion at first, waiting for the inevitable rebuke, the inevitable reminder of his worthlessness. But none came. Instead, he heard the quiet hum of her voice, low and steady, as she returned to her work. It was not a song he recognized, but it carried a warmth that felt out of place in the cold mansion. His frown wavered. He did not understand her, did not know why she had not scolded him, why she had not turned away in frustration like all the others. He turned back to his torn page, staring at it as if her presence had changed it somehow. For the first time, he felt something shift, tiny, fragile, but real. It was not hope, not yet. It was curiosity. Marissa did not linger in front of him like the tutors had, towering over him with impatience. She bent instead, smoothing one of the ruined sheets with careful hands, pressing its torn edges flat, as though it were precious. She set it gently back on the desk in front of him, not as a judgment, but as an offering. Her eyes met his briefly, steady and warm, before she turned away. She did not press him to try again, did not flood him with instructions. Instead, she returned to her dusting, her hands moving rhythmically, her body angled just enough to remind him she was there, but not close enough to trap him. The boy sat frozen, confusion clouding his face. No adult had ever left him space. No adult had ever spoken to him with anything but disappointment or command. This was different, and he did not know what to do with it. He watched her as she moved through the room, her hum filling the silence with something unfamiliar yet soothing. It was not a song he recognized, but it carried a tenderness that settled into his chest like a faint warmth. His pencil rested lightly between his fingers now, no longer clutched like a weapon, but he did not move it. He simply stared at her, at the way she worked with patience and grace, as though the world were not in a rush. He frowned, then softened, then frowned again, his mind circling the strange sensation stirring in him. It was not hope, exactly. Hope was too dangerous, too easily crushed. But it was something he had not felt in a long time: curiosity. That night, when the mansion grew quiet again, and he lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, the boy replayed the moment over and over. He remembered her words, her voice low, and even not mocking but gentle. "You grip that pencil like it's a sword." The phrase rolled through his thoughts like a secret riddle. He whispered it aloud once, testing it on his tongue, and for a moment he smiled, small and uncertain. He had never been given words that felt like gifts before. He had only been handed words that cut and bruised. But these stayed with him, tucked deep inside, and for the first time in many nights, he drifted to sleep without the usual weight pressing against his chest. In the servants' quarters, however, the whispers had already begun. "Did you see her in the study?" one maid said, her voice laced with disdain, acting like she knows better than tutors. Another scoffed, "She'll end up like the rest. Wait and see. The boy is impossible." Their voices curled around the kitchen walls, their judgment sharp and certain. Marissa heard them, but she did not flinch. She kept her head down, polishing the silver with steady strokes, her expression unreadable. Inside, she felt the sting of recognition. She had been underestimated all her life, dismissed before she was given a chance. Their whispers were nothing new, nothing strong enough to shake her. She was not here to impress them, nor to prove herself to the man who signed her paycheck. She was here because she recognized the storm in that boy's eyes, because she had lived through it and survived, because her mother's lessons demanded to be carried forward. The boy, unaware of the gossip below, lay upstairs clinging to the memory of her presence. He could not explain why it mattered, only that it did. The weight of his father's voice, the sting of the servants' whispers, the endless FS carved across his papers, all of it felt, for the first time, slightly less permanent. He remembered her smoothing the torn sheet as though it were not ruined, as though it could still matter. That thought alone made something inside him stir. When sleep came, it carried him gently instead of dragging him into nightmares. The next day, he entered the study with the same dread as always, but this time, he found himself glancing at the door, waiting to see if she would appear. When she did, his chest lifted almost imperceptibly, though he would never have admitted it. She moved through the room quietly, her bag over her shoulder, her scarf tied back neatly. She did not address him, did not interrupt. She simply let her presence be known, steady and calm. He picked up his pencil and tried again, not for his father, not for tutors who had already abandoned him, but because he wanted to know what she would say if he tried. In the days that followed, her words lingered with him like a flame sheltered from wind. They were small, but they were alive, and they warmed places inside him he had believed long frozen. He found himself gripping his pencil differently, not as tightly, remembering her comparison. He found himself watching the paper less as an enemy and more as something that might, just might, yield if he approached it differently. Each failure still stung, each mistake still burned, but they no longer felt like the final word. Something new had been planted, something fragile yet undeniable. When morning broke, the boy woke with a strange lightness, though it was faint and unfamiliar. He still carried the dread of another day, but there was something else beneath it, something like a spark. He rose, dressed, and moved through the marble corridors that gleamed as always, but the walls felt less suffocating than before. His father's voice thundered somewhere in the distance, giving orders to staff, but the boy's ears were tuned differently now. He listened instead for the hum he had heard the night before, the sound of Marissa's presence. He didn't know why, but he wanted to hear it again. In the kitchen below, the servants whispered, their voices sharp with certainty. She was in the study again, one maid said, rolling her eyes. Acting like she belongs there. She'll end up fired. Another replied, bold of her to try. He's impossible. None of them last. Their words carried the same dismissive tone the boy had heard his whole life. But what they didn't know was that their whispers no longer cut as deeply. For the first time, he had something stronger than their judgment. He had her words. He carried them like armor, and though they were small, they shielded him in ways nothing else ever had. That afternoon, he found himself drifting toward the study again, pencil in hand, though he told himself it didn't matter. He sat at the desk, papers laid out before him, the familiar weight of frustration ready to return. But when the pencil pressed into the page, he remembered her voice. He loosened his grip just slightly, as if to test her theory. The pencil slid more smoothly across the paper. The letters still wavered, but not as violently. He frowned, uncertain, but a tiny thread of possibility tugged at him. He tried again, not with the frantic desperation of yesterday, but with the echo of her calmness guiding him. Marissa appeared quietly, her bag slung across her shoulder, her scarf tied neatly back. She did not rush to him, did not comment immediately. She moved about the room with her steady rhythm, humming softly, dusting the shelves. The boy watched her out of the corner of his eye, pretending not to care, but feeling his chest ease with each note of her hum. The tension that always coiled in him began to unravel. For a few moments, he allowed himself to believe he was not at war with the page, but simply trying. That was new. That was different. Later, when he climbed into bed, he replayed it all again. He thought of the way her presence filled the study without words, the way she allowed silence to be something safe rather than suffocating. He thought of the steadiness of her hum, the way it wrapped around him like a shield. He thought of the tiny moment when his pencil had moved more smoothly, when the letters had wavered less. It was such a small thing, but to him it felt monumental. He lay back, eyes closed, and instead of repeating, "Maybe I'm broken," he repeated her phrase. No wonder the paper fights back. The words, once puzzling, now felt like a key. The next morning, he awoke with the phrase still in his mind. He whispered it aloud before leaving his room, testing it again, and it made him feel less alone. As he walked through the mansion, past servants who whispered, past staff who barely looked at him, he carried the phrase like a secret weapon. His father's glare at breakfast did not sting as sharply. The weight of his failures did not press so heavily. For the first time in his life, he had something that belonged to him, something no tutor, no specialist, no expensive program had ever given him. The sense that someone understood. Marissa, meanwhile, continued her work without fanfare. She heard the whispers in the kitchen, the predictions of her failure, but she paid them no mind. She moved with quiet confidence, her mother's lessons still alive inside her. She knew the boy's pain because she had lived it, and she knew the power of patience because it had saved her. She did not rush him, did not demand progress. She only offered presence, steady and consistent, the kind of presence she knew could make the difference between despair and hope. The letters leapt from their places, dancing out of order, taunting him with their defiance. He clenched his fists, ready to throw the book across the room, but before the anger could boil over, Marissa's voice reached him. Soft, patient, without command. You ever try listening to the words instead of fighting them? He raised his eyes, confused by the question, suspicious of what trick might follow. But she did not scold or laugh. She pulled a chair beside him and sat without ceremony, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She placed her finger under the first line and began to read, not fast like the tutors who had barked instructions, not sharp like his father's orders, but slowly, with space between each word, as though each sound deserved air of its own. She let the words breathe, and then she looked at him, waiting. The boy's lips parted. At first the sounds stumbled out in wrong order, the letters collapsing into confusion. His cheeks burned, his hands shook, and he pushed the book away. "See," he muttered, his voice rough with shame. "I can't. I'm broken." The phrase had become his shield, his resignation, the explanation for everything. But Marissa did not flinch. She leaned back slightly, her expression calm, her voice even. "You're not broken," she said. "You just see the world in a different rhythm. My mama used to tell me the same thing. Took me years to believe her, but she was right." The boy blinked at her, startled. No one had ever admitted to knowing what it felt like. No one had ever spoken to him as though they understood. She tried again, but this time she didn't point at the words on the page. She drew shapes in the air with her finger, slow and deliberate, each one a letter untangled from its prison. She had him trace them on the table with his finger. No pencil, no pressure, just movement and sound. Then she whispered the sounds, one at a time, not forcing him to match them immediately, but letting him absorb them. The boy's brow furrowed in concentration, his lips moving tentatively, his hand tracing the shape again. And then, without realizing it, he connected them. The word came out, shaky but whole. He paused, wide-eyed, then stumbled through the next, and the next, until at last he reached the end of the line. He sat back, breathless, staring at the sentence he had just spoken aloud. For a heartbeat, silence held the room. Then his mouth curled into a smile he had not felt in years. "I did it," he whispered, disbelief and wonder colliding. Marissa's grin spread across her face, her eyes warm with pride. She clapped softly, not loudly enough to startle him, but firmly enough to affirm the moment. She tapped the page gently and said, "See, they don't hate you. You just needed them to slow down long enough to understand you." The boy's chest swelled, and he touched the page as though it were a treasure map instead of a battlefield. For the first time, words had not defeated him. For the first time, he had won. That night, he carried the book to his room and slipped under the covers with it. He held it close, tracing the letters with his finger in the dark, whispering the sentence he had read over and over. The words did not fight him this time. They came slowly, unevenly, but they stayed. He fell asleep not with the echo of failure, but with the echo of victory, small yet monumental. The following afternoon, Marissa returned to the study. The boy was waiting, pencil sharpened, eyes bright with anticipation. He tried again, this time with chalk on the blackboard. Some days the frustration still boiled up. Some days the tears came, and papers still tore under his grip. But Marissa never rushed him, never scolded him. She guided him through each stumble, broke the words into sounds, into shapes, into rhythms. And each time, he found that he could do more than he had believed. Word by word, line by line, she unlocked doors no one else had noticed. Doors she knew, because she had once been locked behind them herself. His voice trembled when he whispered, "I did it," but the words carried more strength than all the red F's stacked in his drawer. Across from him, Marissa leaned back in her chair, her smile wide and steady, her hands clapping softly as though she knew that too much noise might break the fragile miracle. Her eyes were warm, her voice gentle as she told him the words he needed most, that the letters were not his enemies, that they were waiting for him to catch their rhythm. It was as if she had turned the whole world upside down with one phrase, shifting failure into possibility, shame into resilience. He touched the page again, tracing the sentence with his fingertip, his smile spreading despite himself. The hours that followed were unlike any he had lived before. Where once the study had been a prison, that afternoon it felt like a place where something could finally grow. Marissa guided him slowly, never hurrying, letting each small step stand on its own. She had him repeat the same sentence until it became familiar. Then she gently introduced another. He stumbled, faltered, nearly gave up, but each time her calm voice anchored him. "It's all right," she said when his pencil slipped. "Try again, just a little slower." When his frustration rose and he clenched his fists, she told him of her mother, of nights spent at a rickety kitchen table where words danced and slipped just as they did for him. She told him how her mother refused to believe she was broken, how patience had been the tool that unlocked her chains. The boy listened, astonished, because no one had ever admitted to sharing his pain. No one had ever shown him that his struggle was not a solitary curse. That night, when the boy carried the book upstairs, his steps were lighter than they had been in years. He crept under the covers with the lamp glowing softly beside him and opened the page he had conquered. He traced each word again, whispered them aloud in the dark, and when he finished the sentence without stumbling, his heart pounded with joy. He whispered it again and again until sleep finally pulled him under. He dreamed not of locked gates or broken trophies, but of letters lining up in order, steady and kind, like friends waiting for him. The next morning, the mansion's halls no longer felt entirely suffocating. The marble floors still gleamed, the chandeliers still sparkled, but he no longer saw only reminders of failure. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he carried the victory of that sentence, the memory of Marissa's steady eyes and soft applause. His father's voice still cut through the air with commands, and the servants still whispered in corners, but their noise no longer defined him. He had proof now, proof hidden in a single line of text, that he had conquered. He was not worthless, not entirely. When he returned to the study, Marissa was already there, her rag folded neatly beside her, the chalkboard cleaned and ready. She greeted him not with ceremony, but with her usual calm presence. She opened the book again, pointed to the line, and gave him the smallest nod. He leaned forward, hands trembling, lips moving cautiously, and then the words slipped from his mouth again, less shaky this time, more sure. He finished, looked at her, and saw pride in her smile. "You see," she said, "the more you practice, the more they'll stay still for you." He laughed softly, a sound foreign in that room, but it carried upward into the high ceiling, breaking the silence that had always drowned him. The servants noticed changes almost immediately. They whispered in the pantry about how the boy lingered in the study now, how he carried books under his arm instead of hiding them beneath his bed. "He's different," one said, doubtful. "No, it won't last," another answered. "That maid will fail like the rest. Just wait." Yet, the boy kept showing up, and Marissa kept meeting him where he was. She turned learning into shapes drawn on the table, sounds whispered slowly, rhythms tapped with a pencil. She refused to let him drown in the panic of failure. Each success, no matter how small, was celebrated quietly, enough for him to feel it settle inside his chest like a flame refusing to go out. As weeks passed, the boy's progress grew visible even to himself. He found sentences less threatening, words less hostile. Mistakes still came, and shame still lurked. But each time Marissa reminded him that the letters did not hate him, that they were simply waiting for him to see them clearly. And each time, he believed her a little more. One evening, he read an entire passage without stopping, his cheeks flushed with triumph. He looked up to see her watching, her eyes glistening, and he realized he wanted to keep chasing that look, that pride, that warmth. The study, a room that had been his battlefield of failure, was now the only place in the house that carried even a trace of light. He felt it in his chest when he heard her steps in the hallway, steady and unhurried, each one like a promise that she would not abandon him the way others had. He sat straighter, his shoulders less heavy, his heart beating faster not with fear, but with anticipation. Marissa entered with the same calmness, her leather bag slung across her shoulder, her scarf tied back as always, her hands steady as she set down her work. She never treated the study like a classroom, never forced him to obey commands like the tutors before her. She simply pulled out a chair, sat quietly, and opened a book or picked up chalk, waiting for him to begin when he was ready. That patience, more than any technique, pulled him forward. The boy began to change in ways that startled even himself. He found that when he traced letters in chalk on the blackboard, they did not always slip away from him. When he whispered sounds under his breath, they sometimes formed words that held together. He stumbled still, often and painfully, but instead of crumpling the paper and retreating into shame, he looked to Marissa. And she was always there, nodding gently, her eyes steady, her voice reminding him that mistakes were not the end but part of the rhythm. "You're learning," she told him. "It doesn't have to be perfect to count." Those words echoed louder than all the shouts he had endured in years past. Downstairs, however, the atmosphere was very different. The staff gathered in the kitchen, the clatter of dishes underscoring their whispers. "She's teaching him," one maid said, her voice thick with disbelief. "A maid of all people. Bold, isn't she?" Another chuckled bitterly. "Bold and foolish. When the boss finds out, she'll be thrown out faster than the rest. Mark my words, it won't last." A third added, "It isn't her place. Tutors couldn't fix him. She thinks she can." Their laughter rose, not cruel so much as certain that history would repeat itself. They did not understand that history had already been broken. Marissa heard every word. She polished the silver with her usual care, her face composed, her movements steady. Inside, she felt the sting of their judgment, but she did not let it shake her. She had grown up surrounded by voices like theirs, voices that told her she was not enough, that she was foolish to try, that she should know her place. She had learned then what she carried now, that their voices were not the truth, that patience was a language louder than doubt. She had no intention of stopping. The boy, meanwhile, had stopped listening to them entirely. Their whispers still reached his ears, curling through vents and hallways, but they no longer pierced him. He carried something stronger now, something that shielded him from their certainty. He sharpened his pencils each morning, lined them in a row, prepared his notebooks before she even entered the room. He was ready, eager, almost desperate for the moment when her voice would guide him again. The dread that had once consumed him had been replaced with anticipation. For the first time in his life, he wanted to learn. Evenings found him in his room, not hiding failed papers beneath his bed as he once had, but poring over the books she had touched. He traced the sentences they had practiced, whispered them in the dark, repeated them until sleep pulled him under. He no longer whispered, "Maybe I'm broken." Instead, he whispered the words she had given him, words that reminded him he was not alone in this struggle, that patience could untangle even the most knotted lines. The trophies still gleamed from his shelves, but now he did not see them as reminders of his father's impossible expectations. He saw them as future victories, spaces waiting to be filled by achievements of his own. The days blurred into weeks, and his transformation grew impossible to hide. His handwriting, once jagged and torn, grew steadier. His voice, once timid and broken, grew stronger when he read aloud. His eyes, once dulled by hopelessness, now carried sparks of focus and pride. The servants noticed, though they dismissed it as temporary. "It's a phase," one muttered. "He'll fall back soon." But in the study, Marissa knew differently. She saw the light in his face, the determination in his small hands, the way he leaned toward the book instead of away from it. She saw the boy becoming more than his father's judgment, more than the whispers of the staff, more than his own fears. And though the father had not yet noticed, the house itself felt different. The silence that had once pressed so heavily seemed to loosen. There were moments when the boy's laughter, rare and awkward, echoed faintly down the hall. There were moments when the sound of his voice reading aloud slipped under doors and into the ears of servants who pretended not to listen but felt their certainty waver. There were moments when the boy's small victories began to shift the air in the mansion, cracking open walls that had stood for years. The boy sat alone at his desk in the study, the same desk where he had once torn page after page in frustration, the same desk where the word worthless had been hurled at him again and again. But this time there was no heavy shadow of fear pressing down on him. His pencil was sharpened to a fine point, lined neatly against a stack of blank pages, and though his hands trembled faintly, his posture was different. His shoulders no longer slumped as if crushed by an invisible weight. He sat straighter, his back supported by something stronger than defiance, belief. Not belief born of his father's empire or of programs bought with money, but belief planted by Marissa's patience and watered by each small victory she had coaxed from him. Marissa lingered by the doorway, her presence steady but unintrusive. She did not hover like the tutors had, their eyes sharp, their voices ready to correct. She stood where he could see her if he chose, where her silent nod could reach him if he faltered. Her hands held no chalk, no books, no plans. They rested loosely at her sides, her scarf tied back, her face calm. She had prepared him not with drills or punishments, but with rhythm, patience, and the quiet courage to try again. Now, it was his test alone, and she understood better than anyone that this was his moment to own. The boy's fingers curled around the pencil. The first question stared up at him, letters and numbers that once would have blurred and twisted until he felt suffocated. He breathed deeply, remembering her words. Slow down. Let the letters breathe. They don't hate you. They just need time. He whispered them inside his mind and let the pencil move. At first it felt like stepping into cold water, shocking and uncertain. His hand trembled as he traced the letters, forming the answer. But when he reached the end of the first line, he realized he had not drowned. He tried again, slower, steadier, letting each word take shape one piece at a time. The page filled, not with perfection, not without mistakes, but with his effort laid bare in strokes of pencil that did not crumble into panic. Each completed answer strengthened him. Each line steadied his breathing. By the end, he was sitting taller, his eyes clear, his face set with determination. He had not been rescued, had not been carried. He had done it himself, with the echoes of her patience at his back. When he placed the pencil down, his chest ached with the weight of what he had done. He stood, his legs trembling, and carried the paper himself through the halls of the mansion. The marble floors no longer felt as hostile beneath his shoes. The chandeliers above did not mock him with their brilliance. For once he felt he belonged to the space he moved through, even if only for this moment. His small hands clutched the paper as though it were a key. He reached his father's office, the door looming as tall and heavy as judgment itself. He knocked once, then stepped inside, his head held higher than it had in years. His father sat behind the massive desk, mountains of contracts before him, his pen scratching across paper, as if the boy's presence were an interruption he could not afford. Irritation flickered across the man's face as he took the sheet from his son without interest. He glanced at it as he always had, expecting failure, expecting disappointment. But then his brow furrowed, his eyes narrowed. The pen slipped from his hand. The silence in the office grew heavy as the man flipped the page over, scanning every line, reading each answer as though searching for the trick. But there was no trick. The grade was marked at the top in bold, undeniable red. Not an F, not a pity C, not even a curved B. It was an A, a clean, sharp, perfect A. For the first time, the billionaire who built towers and crushed competitors found himself speechless. His lips parted, but no words came. His hand trembled slightly as he held the page, as though it had betrayed him, as though it had rewritten a story he had already decided was final. He looked up, expecting perhaps to see his son, smirking or trembling. But the boy stood silent, his small body steady, his eyes calm, waiting not for judgment but for recognition. He did not flinch under his father's gaze, did not shrink as he once had. Instead, he tilted his head, his eyes shifting to the doorway. There, half hidden, Marissa stood with her cleaning rags still in hand, her presence quiet, her expression unreadable. The boy's gaze held steady, as if to say, "Here is the truth." His father followed his eyes, and for the first time truly saw her, not as staff, not as a name on a payroll, but as the one who had accomplished what wealth could not buy. The silence stretched, heavy and unyielding. For a long moment, The only sound was the boy's steady breathing, the same boy who had once sat slumped and broken at his desk. He did not smile, did not gloat, did not rush to defend himself. He only lifted his chin slightly, his eyes drifting past the imposing figure at the desk and toward the door where Marissa lingered. She had not stepped into the room fully, her shoulders framed by the doorway, her scarf tucked neatly behind her ears, the rag she still held hanging limply in her hand. She had not expected to be pulled into this moment, had not expected his eyes to call her forward silently. But there she was, the quiet truth behind the boy's victory. His father, accustomed to dismissing staff as nothing more than background to his empire, followed his son's gaze. When his eyes met Marissa's, he paused. For a moment, his mind could not reconcile what he was seeing. This was not a polished tutor with credentials, not a specialist whose invoice demanded 6 figures, not a program bought at the highest cost. This was a maid, dark-skinned, plain, carrying nothing but patience. Yet the evidence sat in his hand, a clean, undeniable A. The father leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning beneath him, the paper trembling in his grasp. His lips parted, but instead of the harsh dismissal Marissa expected, instead of threats or accusations, his voice came quieter, almost reluctant. "You saved him," he said, as though the words were pulled from him against his will. His eyes flicked back to the test, then to her again, the disbelief still raw on his face. "Name your raise. From now on, you don't scrub floors. You will be his tutor." Marissa felt her throat tighten, the sting of tears pressing hard against her eyes. She wanted to let them fall, to let relief and pride pour out of her in waves, but she forced her composure to hold. She nodded once, steady, her face calm though her chest swelled with gratitude and vindication. For years, she had carried her mother's lessons quietly, unseen by the world, unvalued beyond the small spaces where patience and love could survive. Now those lessons had broken through the marble walls of a mansion that had never believed in them, and the weight of that truth threatened to overwhelm her. She stepped back from the doorway, clutching the rag more tightly, needing its rough texture to anchor her. Her eyes burned, but she did not let the tears fall until she was alone. The boy, watching the exchange, felt his chest surge with something new. It was not the fleeting relief of escaping punishment, nor the shallow joy of earning a grade. It was pride, not just in himself, but in her. For the first time, someone had stood at his side long enough to prove the world wrong, and now the man who had called him worthless was acknowledging it. The boy's lips parted slightly, but no words came. He did not need them. His gaze at Marissa was enough, his silent gratitude etched into his eyes. In the kitchen later that night, the staff buzzed with gossip. "Did you hear? She's been promoted. A maid turned tutor? Impossible. She must have done something. No, it's true. The boy aced." The old man himself admitted it. Their whispers, once thick with doubt and mockery, now carried awe and a grudging respect. They had underestimated her, just as the world always had, but she had done what none of the specialists could. Still, Marissa did not bask in their surprise. She folded her rag neatly, placed her supplies back in order, and carried herself with the same quiet dignity as always. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, everything had. That evening, the father summoned her again, not to scold, but to negotiate. He sat across from her at his desk, the same desk where he had once declared his son worthless. The contrast was sharp enough to sting. He asked her how she had done it, his tone clipped with curiosity rather than contempt. Marissa spoke little, offering no grand explanations. She told him only that patience had unlocked what punishment had buried, that his son did not need more pressure but more time. The father frowned, as though the simplicity of her answer insulted him, as though he could not accept that something so gentle had succeeded where all his money had failed. Yet he said nothing more. He signed papers, made arrangements, and officially named her the boy's tutor. When she returned to the study, the boy was waiting. He looked at her with wide eyes, unsure what to say. She smiled softly, placing her bag on the chair as she always had, her tone light but steady. "Back to work," she said. And just like that, they picked up where they had left off, as though the world had not shifted, as though the mansion's walls had not just witnessed the impossible. Behind him, Marissa lingered in the study, no longer the forgotten maid, but the quiet force who had rewritten the boy's path. The father leaned forward, searching for words that would explain away what had happened, but none came. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, the paper with the perfect score still trembling in his hands. His wealth, his reputation, his authority, none of it shielded him from the truth that stared back at him. The boy took a step closer, not out of defiance, but out of necessity. His voice was calm, so calm it unsettled the room. "I didn't win because you gave me books," he said, each word pronounced with the precision of someone who had learned the power of patience. "I didn't win because of tutors you paid for. I won because she," his eyes shifted briefly to Marissa, "taught me that I was worth the effort. She gave me time when you gave me nothing but anger. She gave me belief when you gave me shame. You had everything, but you gave me nothing." The words cut sharper than any raised voice ever could. They carried the weight of years of neglect, the weight of bruises left not on skin, but on spirit. The father flinched as though struck, his face tightening, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the arm of his chair. No one had ever spoken to him like this, not his partners, not his rivals, not even his wife. The boy's tone lacked venom, but it was precisely that lack of rage that made it undeniable. The truth was laid bare, unadorned and unshakable. Marissa, standing in the background, lowered her gaze, her throat tight with emotion. She had not taught him to fight with fists or with shouting. She had taught him to speak with truth, to let the quiet strength of belief carry further than any blow. And now he stood there, wielding that strength, not as a child crushed beneath cruelty, but as someone who had risen above it. The father's chest rose with uneven breaths. He looked at Marissa, then back at his son, and for the first time in his life, he did not see an extension of himself or a burden to his name. He saw a boy who had walked through fire and had come out not burned, but sharper, clearer. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint tick of the clock on the wall. The boy's final words sealed the moment. "I am not your shame anymore. I am my own proof, and she is the reason." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The words lingered in the air, echoing louder than any accusation. The father dropped his eyes to the desk, the paper trembling one last time in his hand before it slipped from his fingers. It fluttered onto the surface like a surrender flag, a quiet acknowledgement that he had lost something greater than control. He had lost the chance to be the one who gave his son worth. He had poured money into tutors, into systems, into appearances, but he had never given the one gift that mattered: belief. The house itself seemed to breathe differently after that. The staff whispered in corners, not with mockery, but with awe. Marissa, once overlooked, now carried herself with a quiet dignity that no one could challenge. The boy, still young but no longer uncertain, walked through the halls with a steadiness that made others step aside. And the father, once unshakable, moved with a heaviness that told the world he had seen his empire of pride collapse beneath a single truth spoken by his own son. That night, the boy returned to his room, where the books Marissa had borrowed for him sat neatly stacked. He touched their spines lightly, remembering the long nights spent reading under her guidance, her patient corrections, her steady encouragement. He sat by the window, the moonlight spilling across the floor, and whispered a quiet thank you, not only to her, but to himself, for not giving up when it would have been easier to fold under the weight of humiliation. Marissa found him there, her step soft as she entered. She did not speak at first, only placed her hand gently on his shoulder. He looked up at her, his eyes no longer filled with doubt, but with certainty. She smiled faintly, her voice low. "You proved it, not to him, but to yourself. That is what matters most." The boy nodded, his heart full, the lesson etched deeper than any textbook could teach. In another room, the father sat alone, the glass of whiskey untouched beside him. He stared at the wall, hearing his son's words replay again and again, each repetition heavier than the last. He had spent a lifetime chasing power, buying respect, forcing obedience. Yet in the end, respect had come not through wealth, but through belief, something he had never understood until it was too late. The realization gnawed at him. carving into the core of who he was. He was not ruined, not in the eyes of the world, but inside he knew he had been defeated. The boy did not need his validation anymore. The boy had built his own foundation, and Marissa, the woman he had once seen as nothing, had become the cornerstone of that triumph. The message lingered beyond the mansion's walls, beyond the whispers of the staff and the silence of the father. It was simple, undeniable, and unbreakable. Wealth can buy tutors, books, and appearances, but it cannot buy belief. Love and patience, given freely, can build what fortune cannot. The end. If you've stayed with me through this story, I'd like to ask you something before we close. If the journey touched you, if the message struck a chord, make sure to hit the like button so more people can find it. And if you want to hear more stories with twists that challenge how we see power, family, and respect, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. What did you feel when the boy finally spoke those words to his father? Did you expect the ending to turn out this way, or did it catch you by surprise? Tell me in the comments, and also share where in the world you're watching from. Your perspective adds something real to this conversation, and I always enjoy reading the stories and reflections you leave behind.